So back at Galaway, John has been putting the pieces together. He's been watching Eugene. I'm going to have to do this a couple of times during the story tonight, where I'm going to have to give you a sidebar update because I had to pull some stuff out. So via the cleaning crew, John sent word to the North Tower that the king expected Percy for dinner. John hadn't let Willy in on his suspicions. He had formed a plan to flush his bird, and it would work best if both Percy and the king could be taken by surprise. And if it doesn't work, John thought to himself, well, if it doesn't work, I shall look the fool, and Percy will know I'm on to him. If that happens, it will be doubly hard for me to prove. I'm content with taking the chance. I'll have extra wine brought up from the cellars. No sense in not making my bet as sure as possible. Earl, I'm actually reading, because I think Earl's the only one who hasn't been in on this. I'm reading from a first novel by an author named MJ McGalliard. And if you want to know more about him and the book, click on the title board to my left, your right. Okay, back to the story. The muffled footsteps of the horses was the only sound in the grayness. As soon as the fog had enveloped them, Cruith had insisted on silence. Cruith insisted that the horses' hooves be wrapped in cloth to lessen their sound. Soon everything was damp from the prevailing wetness that surrounded them. The fog seemed to seep into their very bones. Saddles, horses, and people alike ran with condensation. Every so often, Cruith would stop the line of connected travelers and whistle, grunt, or give a call. The language of these calls changed at different points, but Cruith always listened intently after each sounding. Sometimes she would listen for an echo, but more often, an animal of some sort would cry out in response. Every species that inhabits a regular forest also inhabits the Grey Goose Hills. The fog, however, created a unique environment. Sight and color have no meaning in a forest of fog and are unimportant to animals that live there. Every animal was gray, their eyes dull and nearly sightless. Every living thing depended on sound for survival. Sound located food as well as enemies. Their ears were finely tuned and shifted about, monitoring the locale even as they slept. By knowing where the different animals lived and having memorized their cries, Cruith knew where she was and steered them toward the end of the fog. Once she halted the train and gave a belch of a bullfrog. Her correspondent sent back to her roars of lions. Dugan was immediately by her side, his sword drawn. "Stand back, lady. I've dealt with lions before. The trick is to charge them first. Give your call again so that I might locate the buggers." "Very well," said Cruith. "You are indeed a brave, brave man." And she again burped like a bullfrog with a belly full of flies. Dugan screamed his war scream and charged into the swirling mist. The party heard his sword hit home and the howling of the beast that he struck, and then they all were treated to a long and interesting string of obscenities. Eventually, Dugan rejoined the party, handing a small furry body to Cruith as he passed. "Well, that's supper for me, at least," said Cruith as he passed. "What happened?" Brishee's voice echoed in the fog around them. "Tell your commander," goaded Cruith. "I killed a squirrel," was Dugan's only reply. "What about the lion? The party's safety was paramount to Brishee." "There was no lion," said Cruith. "It was a pack of vicious squirrels." Dugan asked, "How did you know it wasn't lions?" "I didn't. That's why I said you were brave." None of them could see the look on Dugan's face in the fog. The fog hid many things, including the changes that they were all undergoing. After all, no one leaves the fog the same way they entered it. They did the only thing they can do. They went on. Eugene, back at the castle. Eugene had dressed carefully for dinner. Since Percy and he were the same size, he had his choice of anything in the closet. He was dressing more to buck up his confidence than to impress the court. Having spent so much time making his selections, he had to hurry across the keep and into the castle proper. Not watching where he was going, he slipped in some chicken shit and almost went down on his finely clad ass. He thought it was a good omen that he didn't actually fall. He arrived just as the gong sounded, and to his chagrin found John and the king in everyday doublet and hose. And then, as the aroma of the meal consulted with his nostrils, he resigned himself to another meal of fish. It's fish again. "Good to see you, Percy. You're looking fine this evening," said the king. "Thank you, my lord. We're having fish?" he asked, eyeing something pink, smelly, and uncooked. "Oh, this is a special treat." Willy's eyes brightened. "It's called fondue. What you do is skewer one of these fresh shrimp on one of these long forks, and then you thrust them into the boiling spiced oil. Then what?" "Well, then you eat it." "Oh, I see." Eugene looked on the prospect of eating his dinner in this time-consuming manner much as a convicted murderer looks at the gallows. Willy surveyed the table in puzzlement. "I don't see the boiling oil, John." "Oh, the chef wanted to make sure that it was hot, sire. It's to be brought out last. I'll fetch it if you're ready to start." "More than ready, John, more than ready." The king was licking his royal lips. John bustled out and was back in an instant with a small smoking cauldron held in many towels. Just as he got to the table, he tripped. The direction of his fall shot him and the oil towards Eugene's lap. Eugene was looking the other way, so that only John's warning cry of, "Eugene, look out!" Oh, Eugene snapped around, perceived what was happening, knocked his chair over, getting out of the way. John caught himself in the last instant and didn't fall. He set the pot on the table carelessly. Eugene couldn't understand why it didn't seem to contain anything but a small lump of smoldering charcoal. Well, then he noticed that the king and John were looking at him strangely. For the life of him, he couldn't understand why, and then, the realization slowly dawned on him. He had responded to his name, his real name, Eugene, and not Percy. John had found him out and revealed him to the king in one fell swoop. "My lord," intoned John formally, let me present you your late wife's only cousin, Eugene Donegal." The king was staring at Eugene. "It would appear that some fraud has been committed against us." Eugene knew the game was up. It was best to come clean and make a clear breast of it. "Percy made me do it." "Oh, I'm sure he did, and I have many questions for you, but after dinner, eh? Now, John, bring the real boiling oil and let's get to grilling these small, helpless critters like civilized people." Eugene dutifully sat and ate, although his appetite was as bleak as his prospects. Elphane noticed that he could distinguish the shape of trees around him. The fog was thinning. He'd be almost glad to leave the fog as he had been to get out of... He'd be almost as glad to leave the fog as he had been to get out of the muck that still clung to him in cakes, although all his life he had dreamed of this kind of adventure. Dreaming in a warm, dry, rural library is not the same thing as actually living in the wild and suffering all the discomforts that adventuring entails. He was proud of his bravery in the fight with the slime snakes. He did, however, admit to himself that there was little conscious heroics on his part. He simply responded to the situation. Perhaps, he thought to himself, that's what courage is, simply responding to a set of events before you've had a chance to think about it. A sudden shaft of white light falling on the trail in front of him brought him out of his reverie. They were at last passing through the final shrouds of the fog. The party formed up around Cruith in the bright light of a full moon. Inside the fog, the dull luminescence of the moss kept light from coming from all angles, making it impossible to tell night from day. There's a creek not 100 paces east of here. I say we camp and start fresh in the morning." Everyone agreed with Cruith's suggestion, for they hadn't stopped moving since they'd entered the slime. "We should be safe enough without posting a watch." "We must have a watch," stammered Dugan. "What's wrong with you?" Brishee demanded. "I'm just a little cold." replied Dugan. Then he sneezed so hard that he almost fell off his horse. The big man was shivering uncontrollably. "You look like a corpse they forgot to bury," was Cruith's opinion. "It's just a little head cold," lied Dugan. And then he began to cough so hard for so long that he fainted, and he did fall off his horse. Brishee was instantly kneeling beside him. "Larry, some firewood, Cruith." Oh, Brishee was instantly kneeling beside him. "Larry, some firewood, Cruith. I hope you have some potions to cure this croup." "Oh, I side with Dugan. Elfane, you take the first watch. I'll stake out the horses." With her man in armor down, Brishee saw no reason to risk the rest of her crew. Somewhere in the slime and the fog, she had found respect for all of them, even for Larry. For the first time since the death of her parents, she felt like she belonged. Not belonged to someone, but with someone. She felt fiercely protective of them all, and she was determined to keep them all alive and as well as possible. She spread her bedroll over the prone Dugan and knelt at his side with Cruith. "How does he look?" she asked the healer. "Well, he must have been coming down with this for quite a while. I'd say it's the gray goose grump. I have part of the cure in my bag, but we'll have to sweat the rest of the infection out of him." Just then, Larry returned, staggering under a load of firewood. Fallen branches were plentiful at the edge of the fog. He flung it down and began breaking up small sticks to start the fire. "We'll need 10 times that much wood, and you need to get some stones to heat in the fire." "Is he going to be all right?" asked the once and future prince, real concern showing in his voice. Cruith answered calmly, "Yes, lad. If we hurry. If we're lucky. We'll need to fashion a sweat tent. Elfane, cut some green saplings and then help Larry with the wood. I'll bring the horse blankets as soon as I've got them unsaddled. What else do we need?" Brishee was in command, but did realize she wasn't the expert in the situation. "Well, we'll need water once the stones are hot," replied Cruith, pulling back Dugan's eyelids and examining him. Everyone was so busy, as soon as one task was completed, another was assigned and begun. No one went near or gave a second thought to the ragged curtain of fog behind them or to the dangers that lurked there, the hut was soon finished. To save time and trouble, Brishee directed them to simply build it over where Dugan lay. Within minutes, the fire was raging, heating the smooth stones from the stream bed. Wild eyes followed their movement from behind the misty shroud of the fog. Percy stood with his eyes fixed, his back braced against a tree. He slowly slid down the trunk to a sitting position as his knees weakened. He looked better than he felt, even though he was caked in dried slime. His knees were bloody, and the bandage on his hand was a torn piece of filth. Even worse was the state of his mind. The fever contracted from the slime snakes was inescapable. Crushed by his despair, he focused on the purpose of his mission before he lost consciousness. Larry. He had to get Larry. That much his mind could hang on to, even though he couldn't recall quite why. The last word on his cracked and bitten lips before he slipped into a sea of blackness was, "Larry." And then he was gone, submerged in the private hell of his infected mind. After dinner, the king and John questioned Eugene extensively, trying to gain as much information as possible about Percy's plot. They were obviously not happy with the information they had gleaned. "So, the rumor that I was cheating on the test of kings came from Percy?" "Yes, my lord, through me." Eugene was feeling very humble and cooperative. "And this woman, the tavern owner, Maddie?" supplied John. "Yes, Maddie. She had no idea that it wasn't Percy who was telling her all this." "No, sire. She thought I was Percy, and that all that I said was inside information." "That would explain her convictions. It would appear that several kinds of fraud have been committed here, all directed to the end of stealing my kingdom." The king was silent for some time, absorbed in his own thoughts. "Eugene, had you not been found out and unmasked, would you have confessed to me?" Eugene fought down his initial impulse to lie and say that he was going to confess that very night at dinner. It's true that he had been feeling increasingly uncomfortable, but the thought of telling the truth had not entered his mind. He lowered his head and said, "No, sire, I'd not have confessed while I still thought there was a chance of getting away with it." "Good lad!" cried Willy and beamed at Eugene. John looked confused, and Eugene's head snapped up in surprise. Eugene blinked and said, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I don't think you heard me quite right. What I said was—" "I know what you said, and your honesty has saved you from the dungeon. Well, at least for now. I demand your full cooperation, however, and I'm giving you the opportunity to redeem yourself. You may go back to the North Tower. You may stay there without guards. Although from now on I expect you to take all your meals at my table." John leapt to his feet. "But, Will, do you think that's wise? We have no reason to trust this man. What if he slips off to warn Percy?" "Do you intend to escape, Eugene?" asked the king. "No, my lord." "Very well. We'll see you at breakfast." It was said by way of a dismissal. "I have one more thing to say." Eugene stood and pulled himself up to his full height and looked at Willy straight in the eye. He seemed to have come to a decision about something. "You should be aware that there is a calculated violence in Percy. He told me of no violent plans, but he's capable of murder if he feels there's no other way to win the prize he's set on having. I have no proof of that. It's just something I've known about Percy since we were small. I've always been a bit of a rascal, and I've often been in the company of some pretty rough types, but Percy has always scared me. See here?" Eugene moved his hair so that the scar on his hairline could be seen. "Once when we were boys, I made a jest about his mother. He hit me in the head with a shovel and would have gone on hitting me had not the stable grooms stopped him. He would do that over a jest. Who knows what lengths he would go to for a kingdom." Eugene bowed and left quickly. He was afraid his quaking legs would collapse, and he hadn't meant to tell the king about Percy's temperament. At the same time, he didn't think to deliberately withhold it. It wasn't a conscious decision. The words seemed to come straight from his heart. The partial pardon by the king was a kindness that he couldn't fathom. The least he had expected was to be charged with high treason. Something in the trust given him by the king had sparked loyalty in Eugene. It was an odd feeling for him. He rubbed his chest and he made his way back to the tower. John turned from the door Eugene had gone out and faced the king. "Willy, do you think it's a good idea to trust that scoundrel?" "John, we've already seen that trust pay off. If we keep the man in prison as a prisoner, he'll tell us only what he has to tell us. On the other hand, if we take him into our confidence, he just might tell us all he knows." "I can see that. I just can't understand why you're not angry." "Oh, but I'm livid, John. However, the situation is so grave that I must look at it as Willy the king, not Willy the man. That's why we have laws, to separate the need for justice from the need for revenge." John breathed deeply. "I'm sorry, Will. It's just that your son is at risk too. I understand. But I need your help and good counsel to decide what to do. For now, let's retire. I can think of no good that we can do tonight." A look passed between the two fathers that revealed their anguish. Both of them understood that they needed some time to put away the panic they were feeling for their sons. Sidebar. And with that, we're actually going to leave the doings at Galaway Castle for quite some time. John and Eugene, and Eugene, as you see, turns out not to be so bad, will be working with King Willy to solve the mystery of the missing pages and the quest. And at one point in the story, the questing party will see the amazing sudden appearance of one of the artifacts they're hunting, and this is a direct result of what the boys have figured out back at the palace. Look for it. It'll actually not happen till next week, I think. Look for it, and if you want to know what happens, read the whole book. On we go. The party was pretty much pooped. Dugan seemed to be through the worst of it. His quaking had subsided. Cruith ordered that the steam was to be kept up in the sweat tent for another 3 hours and went to her rest. The fire was banked, and plenty of wood lay waiting to feed the flames. Stones were heating, and water was stored in 3 leathern buckets ready to pour over the hot stones inside the tent. All was well. It came to be Larry's watch. Percy stirred. His swollen, sticky eyelids parted, and he peered out at the world. A tatter of the gray fog slipped past his face. It was as if a curtain had opened on a play. Percy saw Cruith come out of the tent and stuff herself into her sleeping skins, and Larry entered the tent with a bucket. Larry. The thought pushed Percy up and to his feet. Larry! Taking great care, Percy crawled silently up to the entrance of the tent. None in the camp stirred. They were all experiencing the euphoria of exhaustion. Larry had managed to keep moving through a crude sense of duty. Percy watched him from outside the tent, dagger in hand. Larry poured water over the glowing stones, and steam filled the tent. A single candle threw an odd orange glow over the interior. Larry removed the box containing the artifact from the pouch slung around his neck. He turned it over and over in his hands. Percy's brow furrowed in concentration. The wet warmth of the steam rising from the stones relaxed Larry. His fatigue enveloped him. His head began to nod, sinking down until his chin rested on his chest. His eyes lost focus, and they closed. The box containing the artifact slipped from his fingers and landed next to the steaming rocks. The box popped open. Even in his crazed state, Percy recognized the lost artifact. Quickly and quietly he slithered into the tent. This was a prize that would surely help him become king. First he'd get the artifact, and then he'd slit Larry's throat. Just as his trembling fingers touched the shiny crystal, the box snapped shut. Percy defied all his impulses to scream and curse. He struggled with the box to free his fingers from the jaws of the trap. Just as Percy wrenched his hands free, leaving 3 of his fingernails within the box, Dugan opened his eyes to see the bleeding, wretched creature hovering over him. Percy was biting his lower lip. Blood and spit ran down his chin. His eyes were wild with pain and ambition. Dugan began to struggle, no doubt thinking that some demon had come for his soul. Small, hoarse cries came from his parched throat. Percy knew that he was in no shape now to take on the young prince. Clutching the box in his uninjured hand, he swiftly left the tent and scurried back into the fog. He had won a prize at the cost of his own blood. The prince still lived, however. That problem would have to wait for a better opportunity. Larry awoke and comforted the rapidly weakening Dugan. Dugan soon slipped back into unconsciousness, and Larry fell asleep again, not knowing what he'd lost, nor how close he'd come to the usurper's knife. The questing party moved like an old donkey, so very slow and cranky in the morning. Larry was distracted and of less help than he had been in days. There was much to do, and Elphane found Larry's attitude infuriating. He couldn't understand the inconsistency. Only yesterday Larry had been eager and concerned. Now Elphane had to tell him to do some things twice, if not 3 times, before he finally began to move. Larry, for his part, felt befuddled and confused. He wanted his found trinket back, but given his status as servant, he dare not say anything about having found it and lost it. Dugan was sleeping hard, as one does when one has been sick almost to death. Elphane and Brishee built a litter to be dragged behind Dugan's horse. If they were to move on today without abandoning the warrior, this was their only hope, and Elphane complained bitterly to Brishee about Larry's sluggishness. What's with that cloth? Look how slowly he packs the gear. It's almost as if he doesn't want to leave this place. He sat all night with Dugan. What do you expect? We're all dead tired. Well, if I were in command of this quest, I'd light a fire under him quick enough. Brishee grabbed Elphane's wrist and squeezed until she felt the bones grind together, and then she said in a voice that only he could hear, "But you're not in command of this quest. I am. I have need of a good lieutenant, not a petty tyrant. You've changed. What has happened to you? What has happened to all of us? You a slave one day and a king's captain the next. This bizarre place with its unending dangers. Dugan near death, Larry being a sloth, and the crazy Cruith singing to herself as she saddles her horse. And me, well, I don't know." Brishee looked deep into Elphane's eyes, the empathy born in her bringing instant understanding. "We all have fears, Elphane. All we can do is go on and try and do our duty to our king. Our king! I've worked in his castle since I was old enough to fetch and carry. What do you have to do with him? He's the only man ever to have faith in me. I realized he was trying to solve a difficult problem, and I stumbled into the middle of it. But he's given me a chance, and I intend to make the most of it. And I think the same can be said for you. Let's work together. Elfane nodded, although his jaw was clenched. He finished tying the litter to the horse and rudely shouted for Larry to come and help him lift Dugan onto it. Eventually, the party got underway. He rode slowly and steadily for half a day. Cruith rode beside Brishee, and the two of them in the lead. Behind came Elfane, leading the horse, pulling the litter. As usual, Larry brought up the rear. Suddenly, Cruith stopped. This caused a bit of a pile-up in the tight formation. Brishee had been lulled by the sun and the rocking rhythm of her sauntering horse, and was a little bit late on the uptake. Not knowing what was happening, she pulled up violently on her horse's reins. Brishee's horse had been as complacent as she a moment before. The mare reared up, screaming at the sudden pain in her jaw. This action spooked the rest of the horses, including Ross, who was quick to complain. He'd had more than enough. Ross was a palace stallion and felt that he didn't have to work under such conditions. As a matter of fact, Ross set such a perfect example of bad behavior, it took 10 minutes to get all 24 of the horses' feet on the ground, and still at the same time. Luckily, Dugan wasn't trampled in the rodeo. Elfane passed the reins of the horse that he was leading to Larry and rode forward. Grabbing the bridle of Cruith's mare, he screamed, "What the hell is the bloody idea, woman?" Cruith sat calmly aboard her old mare, who had put up no more than a token effort during the raucous, who was more than happy to stand still, and replied, "My idea of traveling is to stop when you arrive. After all, that's the point, isn't it?" Elfane looked around. All he saw was a slight, misty prairie covered with mounds of fist-sized stones. The mounds seemed to be laid out in some kind of pattern, but from his vantage point on his horse, he couldn't make it out. His inability to understand the pattern increased his ire with Cruith. And just where, pray tell, have we arrived at? Why, Elfane, you goof, we've arrived at the village of Mima. Much to everyone's astonishment, Cruith slipped off her mare, picked up the only loose rock nearby, and knocked on one of the piles of stone. She announced in a loud, penetrating voice, "Hi, Mom! I'm home!" People clad in odd, homespun garments swarmed out of the mounds of rocks. They took hold of the party's horses. Cruith greeted them in their strange local tongue. "You can all get down now. This is the place of my birth, and if we're not safe here, there's no place on Mother Earth where we are safe. Now get down, all of you, and do what these nice people want you to do." All of this was delivered in the same threatening monotone. Even Brishee, who was most familiar with Cruith's odd sense of humor, wondered if they hadn't been taken in by a territorial loyalist radical. Cruith added, "Do it now." They were led one by one into the rock piles and beneath the earth. Elfane came last, and his host had to take him by force. He shouted in his language, "Hostage! I'm being taken hostage!" And they shouted back in their language, "You stink! You need a bath before you enter our village!" Of course, Cruith was the only person who spoke both languages, and she was laughing too hard to interpret. Elfane was afraid of more than just being held hostage and fought back wildly. In the end, the villagers prevailed, and he was carried below the surface into his personal hygiene hell. Sidebar. Meanwhile, Maddie is still in pursuit of both Percy and the questing party. She manages to avoid being eaten by the slime snakes, but loses her horse, and then encounters a maddened Percy. Who she doesn't realize is not the same man she met back in Galaway. She flees in pursuit of the questing party, or at least someone who's not visibly going certifiable. And in her tussle to free herself from Percy, who does not recognize her, and why should he, she wrests the box with the lost artifact away from him. Back to the story. Elfane had a tremendous fear of going underground. Cruith's people hauled him off his horse, and many hands grabbed him. They took him to one of the piles of stone and descended. He had spent his youth at one funeral after another. He was only 5 years old when he had seen his mother lowered into the ground and dirt thrown on top of her. As he was bundled down, Elfhane kept imagining stones pressing against his chest and dirt filling up his nose. He struggled and screamed because he wouldn't allow himself enough air, and he passed out from his hallucinations. That's a fine way to enter paradise. It didn't take long for the rest of the questing party to realize that Cruith's people meant them no harm. Even without translation, it was obvious that the folks from Mima were, well, appalled by the party's filth. Not that the party was particularly enamored with it themselves. They were taken into the caverns and to the place of hot baths. Here, water heated by geothermal sources bubbled into a pool and was drained away into another tunnel. They were stripped, and without any regard for their modesty, their clothing was taken away in sacks. And they were dunked repeatedly into the hot water and scrubbed mercilessly with stiff brushes and soap that smelled of volcanoes. Cruith was acquainted with the ritual, and Brishee was more than willing to part with the dried slime from the Grey Goose Hills. Larry took it like a prince to fine wine and felt that he was back at something he could understand. For Larry, it only seemed fitting that he should have attendance after his long and arduous journey. Only the loss of the artifact troubled him. Dugan was too weak to resist, although he began to rally before they moved on to the next bath. Such was Elphane's fear of being underground that he remained unconscious until the people of Mima threw him unceremoniously into the second bath. The water in the second bath was so cold it was barely liquid. Percy slept peacefully enough. In fact, nothing short of being knocked unconscious would allow him to sleep at all. The raging, viral insanity affected his every waking moment. His sleep was so deep, he was not at all disturbed when the ugly creatures dragged him underground into their cramped and polluted domain. 5 of the troll-like creatures had rolled aside a rock and emerged from the earth. The Drafna came up hesitantly, sniffing the air and searching the clearing with their eyes. They had excellent night vision, since they lived most of their lives in the dimness and were only drawn to the surface in extraordinary circumstances. Percy constituted a most extraordinary circumstance. Even through tons of earth and rock, they could smell Percy's madness. A body infected by the insanity of a slime snake was of special use to them. When the last one was out of the hole, they fanned out in a horseshoe configuration and began to comb the clearing. It only took a few steps for them to locate and bend their shoe around Percy. The most intelligent of the 5 grunted and slobbered. He wiped a bit of foaming blue pus from his eyelids, and from where he stood at the curve of the shoe, smacked his 2 lieutenants, one with each fist. He did this just to make sure he had their attention. Then he grunted in an expository manner, and untied the filthy, ragged blanket that he carried around his shoulders. He backed up and spread the blanket on the ground. The lieutenants, each in turn, clouted the Drafna next to them and grunted an echo of their leader's jargon. Under the rain of blows and abuse, the 2 under-creatures grabbed an arm and a leg apiece and slung Percy onto the blanket. Percy's head sounded a sharp crack when he landed, and his breathing got shallower. The 2 successive blows to his head and the prolonged insanity, coupled with the hardships of the Grey Goose Hills, had in effect put Percy into a coma. The leader quickly dropped to his scabby knees and placed his festering ear on Percy's chest, listening intently. He held his breath and narrowed his eyes. His mangy brows almost touched his cheekbones before he grunted and sprang up deftly, backhanding both his lieutenants. Without a sound, the lieutenants turned and bloodied their peons' noses. Runny sores popped and scabbed over and over again as each one bent and twisted back to the task of grasping an edge of the blanket. Percy was lifted up, and they bore him into the earth. The place they took him to was a far cry from the village of Mima. Percy was no use to them dead. The poison they needed to extend their lives could only be extracted from a living soul, and when, like the Drafna, you're born to grow, breed, and die within a cycle of 1 moon, you grab for all the insanity you can get. And the purpose of life is to grow old before you die, and if the purpose of life is to grow old before you die, and only madness will keep you alive, well, wouldn't you rather be crazy than die? The Drafna thought so. Percy's feet disappeared through the rough hole the Drafna had crawled from. Not seconds later, blue-green arms bearing bloodied hands and with black nails peeling back reached out and rolled the rock back into place. The location of the tunnel was completely unmarked except for the droplets of purple blood that soon evaporated from the sand. The chance wind swept the area completely clean of tracks. As they dragged Percy through the endless warren, he did not dream. His spirit stayed silent and did not stray. During the course of his travels, three of his treeest transporters died. This was not unexpected. And other younger members of the tribe with more functional bodies picked up the burden and hurried it toward the inner chambers to the pot, the boiling pot. That vast reducing vat that delivered up the essence of insanity that gave long life to all the Drafna that partook of it. In the fading light that comes at the very end of the day, Maddie stumbled onto a place where the tracks of the party mixed with hundreds of other tracks. She was bewildered and disheartened. The place she had come to was desolate, mound after mound of rock. Even though it was all too easy for her to imagine Percy was right behind her, she collapsed beside a mound and fell asleep. It was the smartest thing she ever did. Elfane woke to a sensation of cold, utter and complete, chilling cold. Cold, so cold it was painful, and it was everywhere. He was surrounded by cold. Cold permeated his being. The shock brought him more fully awake than he'd ever been in his life. Elfane emerged from the water, gasping and grasping the side of the pool. He shook the water from his eyes, and he saw his companions in the questing party. They were all smiling at him, a brace of clean, happy, familiar faces. He climbed, teeth chattering, out of the pool. "What the bloody hell is going on here?" he asked, not realizing that he was the only one who was naked. "You're taking a bath," replied Brishee. You're taking a bath," replied Brishee calmly. Elfane cast his eyes wildly about him. Are we underground?" "Of course we're underground. This is the village of Mima," said Cruith, pointedly letting her eyes stray to what no woman had seen before. Elfane immediately became short of breath. He began wheezing and choking. One of the citizens of Mima ran forward with the jug of beer and, seizing Elfane's nose, poured the precious stuff down his craw. Elfane gagged and coughed as though he were choking, and the brew suddenly seemed to calm him. I have to get out of here." "Have some more grog, I insist. I'm your commander," ordered Brishee. "And you can put your pants on at will." Elfane's horror to being underground was quickly replaced by more pressing needs of modesty. Percy, still unconscious, was being lowered by rough ropes into the pot. The water appeared to be boiling, but gave off no steam. Actually, the water's temperature was the same as the air in the cave. The Drafna's chant began as soon as his feet touched the water. Percy's eyes fluttered open, but the sight was almost too strange to perceive. The cave around him was illuminated by an eerie blue glow. Percy barely had enough strength to rotate his head and take in the scene. The Drafna's chant grew in volume as they saw evidence that Percy still lived. He could see their malformed faces dominated by huge pus-filled eyes. Enough of his madness had been drained away by the water for Percy to convince himself that all he saw was a hallucination. The level of the water was rapidly descending, and Percy was lucid enough for a moment to wonder why. If this was a hallucination, why did he feel wet? Again, he passed out and sagged against the ropes. The Drafna were careful in the collection of the residue from the ritual. It ran from a spout in the pot to a huge metal dish. Round and concave, the dish had been used for many things before being a part of this apparatus. They lined up. There was no fighting. All of them, from the youngest to the oldest, from the most infirm to the strongest male, shared from the unholy drink. The blue water from the rendered madman would double their lives. Now they would live 2 months instead of 1. Percy had given them the gift of life, and they had inadvertently cured him of the slime snake's sting. The villagers of Mima were feasting their prodigal daughter. The huge common cavern was brightly lit with torches, hidden vents taking the smoke away. There was much roasted meat and dozens of different kinds of mushrooms prepared in many ways, and cheese. The village grew much of its food underground, leaving the land over and around the settlement free for the grazing of their herds. There was strong, barley beer and other concoctions that tasted of dainty fungus. Elfane had found that he preferred the latter, but only after much comparison. Oddly enough, he found that he didn't mind being underground as much as he had before. He didn't even mind conversing with Larry and Dugan, although that was probably due to the fact that there were a few here at this fete that spoke his language. Elfane found that he didn't have a care in the world. Sure, it was a little hard to focus in the torchlight, and he hadn't tried to stand up in over an hour, but this beat the hell out of the slime in the Grey Goose Hills. Larry and Dugan were of similar attitudes. Dugan had responded well to treatment and probably should have been taking more care about inflicting the beer on his recovering body, but he had eaten hugely and he was feeling no pain. Larry was laughing. What had started him laughing he couldn't remember right off, although as his mirth died down it was replaced with regret. Elfane noticed the change in Larry's countenance. "What is it, oh boy? Remember a bad dream?" I lost my box." Elfane was about to make a witless and sophomoric sexual remark when Dugan snapped his eyes open and leaned into Larry. "Was it about so big?" asked the soldier, making a square the size of the box that contained the lost artifact with his hands. Larry seemed to sober. "Yes. How did you know?" "Well, I thought it was a bad dream myself. Some vision come out of my fever." "What are you two talking about?" Elfane felt left in the dark. "I found a metal box so big a few days ago. I accidentally dropped it in a hot spring and it popped open. It had the most beautiful tear-shaped crystal in it, and now I've lost it." Elfane sat back hard against the wall and tried to assimilate what Larry had just said. "It was stolen." "What? How do you know?" "Well, I don't know for certain. It was stolen." "Well, what? How do you know?" "Well, I don't know for certain. It seems that during my fever I woke and saw you, Larry, slumped over asleep. And this man thing, all bloody and crazed looking, holding a small metal box like you've described. He looked familiar, but he was so covered with slime and blood that I couldn't place him. I thought it was all my own ravings, but perhaps there was something to it after all." Elfane snapped out of his reverie. "That was the lost artifact. Why didn't you tell us when you found it? Why didn't you tell us when you lost it? That was the lost artifact, you idiot!" Elfane had Larry around the throat and was squeezing and shaking him so hard that there's no way that he could have answered. Larry discouraged this action by soundly popping him in the nose. Dugan intervened before it could escalate. The feasting around them stopped, and the scuffle even drew the attention of the high table where Brishee and Cruith sat. "Here, what is this? Can't you two behave? We're guests here." Brishee was up and standing over them in an instant. Elfane jumped to his feet and immediately had to steady himself against a wall. We have to go back to where we camped last night. This blundering idiot had the lost artifact in his hand, and he lost it. Dugan thinks that it was taken by some sort of wild man, but that might all be a delusion. Larry had the artifact." He began kicking at Larry where he sat. "This good-for-nothing wastrel had the artifact, and he didn't tell us. And then he lost it, and he still didn't tell us." Brishee pushed Elfane back against the wall and held him there, not really a difficult feat considering the amount of local liquor that Elfane had consumed. "You'll not kick him again, Elfane, or I will kick you where it counts. Now, Larry, you had the artifact?" "I guess I did. I didn't know it was the artifact. I would have told you had I known what it was." He sounded sullen. His good time had been ruined. Elfane interrupted again. "If you cared to learn a little about your kingdom instead of spending all your time between the sheets with other men's wives, you might have known what you had." "Enough!" It was obvious that Brishee meant it. Now, Dugan, you say that you saw someone take it. Well, I think I did. That is, I could have. I was delirious with the fever, and I thought it was another delusion. I'm still not sure that it wasn't. It's maddening not knowing if what I saw was real or not, and it bothers me that the wild men looked somehow so familiar. Oh, I'm sure I had it with me. That night in the sweat tent, I searched everywhere this morning, and it was gone. Larry sounded as lost as the artifact. At that moment, Maddie was ushered into the chamber, still dripping from her bath. She held a small metal box in her left hand. "Now we are 6, muttered Cruith to herself. "My box!" said Larry. "The artifact!" said Elphane. "Maddie!" said Dugan. Maddie collapsed at their feet. Larry grabbed the box, Elphane grabbed Larry, and then they started scuffling and struggling for possession of the artifact. "That's enough!" Brishee punctuated this by cracking their heads together. As they staggered back, clutching their craniums, she relieved Larry of the metal box. Dugan laughed and upped his opinion of Brishee. Cruith was helping Maddie to her feet. Brishee turned to Dugan. "You know this woman?" "Yes, it's Maddie, owner of the Feathered Pig. Maddie, how did you come to be here, and how did you get the lost artifact?" "I got here the same way that you did, through those awful hills, although you managed to keep your horses. When I got that box during a fight with Sir Percy." These statements were followed by a flurry of questions from all sides, and it took some minutes for Brishee to regain control of the interrogation. "Why did you come this dangerous way? Are you following us?" "Yes, I am. The king has promised me 700 pieces of gold if I can bring back proof whether or not Larry is cheating on the test of kings. Percy told me all about this setup, and for the most part it seems to be true. Here you all sit in this hidden village feasting while you're supposed to be out looking for the artifact and the shield of many uses, not to mention finding out what happened to Prince Monaghan. It was Percy who had the artifact, not you." "Percy!" exclaimed Dugan. "Percy was the wild man I saw in my fever. Percy stole your box, Larry." "Dugan, I'm ashamed of you. I've known you for many years, and I would not expect you to lie for that royal lout. You know well as I do that he hasn't been questing. He's been here drinking and dallying with his whore." Maddie pointed at Brishee. Brishee stepped forward, but Dugan held up his hand and spoke first. We've known each other a long time, Maddie, and I hope you believe me when I say I wouldn't lie to you. I knew your father when he first started the Feathered Pig. I've known you since you were a little girl. I have never lied to you, and I'll swear on your father's grave that I am not lying to you now. We've been questing. We've only been here at this village a few hours. Brishee is in command of the expedition, and Larry is her servant. She is not a whore. Do you believe that I would be party to such a sham?" Maddie looked Dugan in the eye, defiantly at first, and then she lowered her gaze. "I don't know what to believe anymore. I'm very confused. When Percy told me all this, it made sense, but then I came to doubt it when I wasn't with him. And then he attacked me without reason. He didn't seem to know me. He seemed crazed. I was lucky to escape. How did he get here so fast?" Maddie swayed on her feet, and Dugan caught her in her faint. Cruith helped Dugan lower Maddie onto a sitting skin. She examined Maddie in the torchlight. "The lass has a horrible bruise on the side of her face." She peeled back one of Maddie's eyelids. "She had too sharp a rap on the side of her head, plus she's exhausted." Cruith spoke to the villagers in their own language, and several of them gently carried Maddie away. She turned to Brishee before she followed. "She'll be fine in a day or two, and will be able to make more sense. I'll see that she's cared for. In the meantime, you should know that the box you hold in your hand you should know that the box you hold in your hand, if it contains a tear-shaped crystal—" "It does! I swear it does!" interrupted Larry. "If it contains that crystal, it's what the people of this village have long called the key to the mountain. It's been gone for us for many generations. After I've seen to Maddie, I'll take you up to the Hall of Pictures and explain to you all I can. I've long had a feeling that this quest would lead to more than just finding out what happened to Prince Monaghan. Now, it seems to me we must lead a war against the Drafna. For it was predicted many lifetimes ago that when the key to the mountain returned to us, so would the Drafna, under the leadership of an evil one who brought with him an indestructible machine of war. At this, she turned on her heel and left. Well, there was a stunned silence, for Cruith had given them a lot to think about. Larry broke it when he turned to Elfane, all hostility forgotten. Why would my uncle follow us? And why would he tell that woman I was cheating on the test of kings? Why would he want me to fail? Elfane couldn't help but feel some sympathy for his former master's confusion. If you fail, and your father produces no more heirs, Percy would become king according to the laws of the kingdom. Larry bit his lip. I thought he loved me. Percy awoke to a sharp pain in his side. He clutched his ribs and tried to roll away from the pain, only to find himself against a rock wall. The pain lessened, and he turned back, looking for the source. The Drafna backed away, brandishing a slime snake's horn. The Drafna, never taking their eyes off Percy, edged through the cell door. When the door was shut, the one with the horn and the other Drafna cheered. Percy stared at them in confusion, not understanding what had made them so happy. He sat up on the rude couch and drank greedily from a gourd filled with water. They cheered again, and one of them slipped a small bowl of what looked like rancid fat underneath the wall of the cage. Percy retrieved and gobbled the food. They cheered again, and Percy fell back onto his pallet. Madness was already seeping into his cells. The Drafna had been confused. Never before had they boiled a madman, and he'd lived. But this one had. At first, they thought that they should kill him, but clearly thinking minds had prevailed. The essence of a madman prolonged their lives, they had argued, and this one had survived the boiling. Why not use him again? They had in their stores horns from slime snakes that they knew caused the madness. Why not reinfect him and boil him as many times as they could? Waste not, want not. Already the population was up a third, due to couples of breeding age living longer. The gestation period was only 24 hours. There were babies everywhere, and new Drafna were becoming sexually mature by the minute. If they could continue like this, they might be of sufficient numbers to attack and hold Mima. Their legends had foretold a day when the Drafna would live in the village of Mima, free of the glowing caves to which they had been banished so long ago. Legend spoke of one who would come to them and give them life. The same person was to lead them. He would become Drafna. He would drink from the holy gourd and eat of the flesh of the Drafna. Percy had done both. Ew! It was the next day before... Let me just say that for all of us. It was the next day before the party assembled in the Hall of Pictures. Maddie looked much better. In fact, she looked better than Elfane and Larry. Both the lads were a little green when they spoke, and they did so quietly and very carefully. Cruith eyed them both keenly before snorting and beginning her narrative. If she spoke too loudly, she did it with malice. She enjoyed seeing the former prince and his former servant wince. In this hall is the history of the future of the people of Mima. Generations ago, we were given a prophet. Her name was Roscommon. This is her, here. Cruith pointed to a portrait on the rough stone wall. It showed a pretty girl, not yet out of her teens. After the first battle with the Drafna, we began to build our village. The Drafna were defeated and banished to live under the Grey Goose Hills. Their numbers were so declined after the war that we no longer viewed them as a threat. Roscommon was but a child. As she grew, she began to fall into swoons at odd times and would speak of things to come. At first, it was thought that she had some strange disease or disorder that caused these fits. Then the wise woman Wicklow realized that the child was having visions. Under Wicklow's care, Roscommon began to clarify what she saw, and the two of them recorded her foretelling here in this hall. Cruith moved to another panel. This is the battle with the Drafna. Ooh, ugly little creatures, said Dugan, eyeing the painting closely. Ugly and dangerous, agreed Cruith. They haven't given us any trouble since their defeat, but Roscommon foretold a time when they would once again rise against us. This shows the battle she foresaw. They moved to the next panel, and it showed the Drafna and the people of Mima locked in mortal combat. Many dead from both sides littered the ground. Leading the Drafna was a man. His face was obscured by a large shield. Projecting from the shield were several rays of light. It seemed, from the painting, that all who stood behind the shield were invincible. Opposing the Drafna were the people of Mima. Leading them was a young woman. She could have been Roscommon herself. Or, if one squinted, she could have been Brishee. The woman held before her the lost artifact, or, as it was known to the people of Mima, the crystal key to the mountain. Elfane was sufficiently shaken by the scene to forget his hangover. It's the shield. It's the shield of many uses. The history says that anyone who stands behind it will not fall in battle. Monaghan had it with him when he went on his quest. Are we to believe that these Drafna have it now? If what is foretold to be is true, yes, Cruith answered solemnly and moved to the next panel. On seeing it, Brishee burst out with, "Well, I don't understand. What happens in this battle? Who wins?" "Well, that we don't know," said Cruith, staring unhappily at the unfinished picture in front of them. The last panel was not complete. The upper portion of the painting showed... portion of the painting showed a bright sunshine on the mountain. The crystal key was raised by unknown hands, as was the shield. A porthole was opened in the mountain, and a man wearing a crown was just stepping up. Beneath that, there was only bare, unpainted rock. Wicklow, who was very old, died before the rest of the vision could be interpreted. Roscommon went completely mad without her help, and in the end, the story has never been known. As a group, they turned to Brishee. It was obvious they all had questions for their leader. Dugan put them to her plainly. "Well, do we stand and fight with these people, or do we go on? What would Willy have us do? Where lies our quest?" Percy lay gasping on the floor of his cage, right where the Drafna had thrown him. He lay there wet and disoriented. He had vague memories of having been boiled again, but he couldn't trust the recollections because he knew he had been mad again. He wasn't entirely sure he wasn't mad still. He took stock and decided that he really was lying on the floor of a crude cell, and he had a wound in his side. Percy looked past the cage and had to reevaluate his sanity all over again. There were scores of blue-green creatures looking at him and chanting one word over and over again. "Rug, rug, rug, rug." The chanting seemed to crescendo on every third repetition. Percy didn't know what rug is in Drafna, but it was the word for God. The Drafna had boiled the madness from Percy twice now, and he still lived. Their numbers had increased fourfold already. There were members of the tribe who had so far lived almost 5 weeks. Unheard of old age for a Drafna. Surely this madman had come giving life, and surely this God would lead them into the promised land of Mima. Leading the chant, a young male opened the door to the cage. With great ceremony, he walked over to the prone Percy, and as the chant reached its loudest point, "Rug! Rug! Rug!" the Drafna pierced Percy's thigh with the horn from a slime snake. The Drafna believed if Percy lived through the madness and the boiling a third time, he surely was Rog, and would lead them in the battle against Mima. Percy slipped back into unconsciousness, thinking, "I've got to get control of this situation." The grand hall of Mima was filled with Mimans. They sat in quiet concentration while Cruith explained to them what she had discovered. There would be a question-and-answer period after she finished. Maddie, although protesting, had been put back to bed with an evil-smelling poultice tied to her head. Brishee sat in her room making her decision. That left Larry, Elfane, and Dugan together in their quarters. Not a great combination. Elfane was pacing, trying to recall all that he knew about the shield and the artifact. Whenever he would remember something, Dugan would deftly write it down. Otherwise, Dugan was primarily concerned with decimating a bowl of fruit. Larry sat, looking white and puzzled. "They say all that stand behind it shall not fall in battle." Elfane was searching his mind about the shield. "We've already got that," said Dugan, spitting out a grapeseed. What about the artifact? What do we know about that? Well, the box was found by Queen Dindy during one of her telescope experiments. She was field testing one day and noticed a reflection on a far hillside. Curious, she sent a man to retrieve whatever it was that was blinding her. It was the box that contained the artifact. Of course, they couldn't get it open. And all the histories say eventually, Queen Dindy did find a way to open the box. Passage into the box was a royal secret given only by kings and queens on their deathbeds to future kings and queens. Steam, said Larry. What? Both Elfane and Dugan wanted to know. It's steam that opens the box. It's a family rhyme. You can bang it, burn it, or throw it against rocks, but it's steam that opens the box. It's something taught me by my tutors. I was called upon to recite it many times as I was growing up. They always said that I'd find out what it meant when I became king. That they, the tutors, didn't know what it meant, but that it was a code, a secret message only known by a king. I had to memorize a whole litany of such rhyming. I was always promised that someday I would know the answers. In fact, there was a rhyme about that, too. When you are crowned, understanding will be found. I always thought it meant that the answers were written in the crown. I stole Dad's once and read what was inside, but it didn't make any sense. It was all runes that I couldn't read. I thought that it must be some kind of code and that the key was also part of the king-making. King Max wrote, "It's steam that opens the box." In fact, he made up most of the royal rhymes. I think that the rhyme that has to do with the box I think that the rhyme has to do with the box of the lost artifact. The first time it opened was in the hot springs. Maybe it opened in Dugan's sweat tent. The stones were very hot, and I had just poured water over them. The steam was so thick that the tent was very oppressive. It started to affect me, too. I was very tired. After all, I was the last one to watch over Dugan, so I was the last one to get any rest. I got groggy. I'd been carrying water and wood for hours, not to mention hot rocks, and I'm sure I had the box out of my pouch, and I was looking at it. I must have fallen asleep, and it opened. Well, unless he could see what was inside, why would Percy take it? Ah, yes, Percy. Dugan made a note on his pad. He wrote Percy in the negative column and began to peel an apple. Elfane, just taking a ham. Oh, I'm close. Elfane responded that he was, after all, sort of an informal court librarian. Well, Percy might have known the box itself. He was, after all, quite a regular lad in the library. Larry seemed to come alive. You mean Percy was in the bloody library? Well, all those times I couldn't find him. Well, actually, it was the one place you never looked. Elfane wasn't quite catty. Dugan tossed the apple peel aside. It was like throwing away a trophy, only no one appreciated the gesture. Elfane was still pacing, and Larry was getting all cloudy and dreamy again. Dugan sighed. He'd peeled the apple so that the peel fell all in one piece. The peel was carefully cut from the top, and the incision continued down the side in a spiral to terminate at the bottom. The peel reeled in a parody of its former self, Dugan's boot. Beside Dugan's boot. The man of war sat back with obvious distaste for his unappreciative companions. The rough hide that was the door to the other room was whisked aside. Brishee stepped through with determined eyes. Dugan attempted to stand, but slipped on the apple peel and was abruptly seated again. Brishee held out the flat metal box that contained the artifact. I've thought about it long and hard. Here's the deal. As I see it, the king has charged us with 3 things: to recover the lost artifact, the shield of many uses, and to find out what happened to Prince Monaghan, said Brishee, ticking them off on her fingers. Thanks to Larry and Maddie, we have the artifact. If the Hall of Pictures is accurate, the Drafna have the shield. Monaghan was last known to have had both of those things. If we recover them both, we might get some clues to what happened to him. So, as I see it, we have no choice but to go to war with the people of Mima against the Drafna. If they don't choose to go to war, we'll still have to try and get the shield from the Drafna. It's our only clue to what happened to Monaghan. Dugan sat, nodding his head in solemn agreement. Larry's expression couldn't be read because he was holding his head in his hands. Elfane was about to reevaluate his thoughts on courage. If courage was acting before thinking, he wondered, well, what if you have time to think about it? Maddie entered, smelling slightly of mustard. Larry sat staring at the tavern owner while Brishee told Maddie of her decision. The greenish-yellow bruise on her temple didn't seem to detract from her flaming beauty, at least as far as Larry was concerned, it didn't. Elfane sat down beside him and said in a calculated whisper, "I've seen that look on your face before, and I have to tell you that we have more important things to think about." "More important than what?" Larry whispered back. Elfane nodded toward Maddie, narrowing his eyes and hissed, "You know." "I was just thinking that except for the hair, she looks a lot like Brishee. A little older, perhaps. They both look very much like the girl in the paintings, that Roscommon." Elfane joined Larry in his close observation of the two women. "Well, if that isn't a fine lot," said Cruith from the doorway. "A tavern owner with a lump on her head, a goat herder, two besotted boys, and a horny old soldier." "I'm not that old," Dugan snapped back. "I've decided that we'll help your people," Brishee said with a voice of command. "I never doubted you would, my dear. We'll stand beside you in the coming battle." "That's very nice. But wouldn't it be better if we had more of a chance in the fight?" "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, the prophecies tell us that when the Drofna come, they'll outnumber us by droves. It's also been said that they'll have the shield and someone to lead them. Well, there's not much we can do about their numbers besides kill them in battle, but if we manage to get the shield and possibly kill their leader, well, we want full access to your myths and legends." It popped out of Elfane like a pimple erupting on the forehead of a 14-year-old. He drew himself up straight and announced, "I have to have full information before I can proceed. The key to this battle could be in the histories. So far in this quest, the histories have served us, kept most of us from getting our bottoms from getting severely scraped." Cruith came out of her dramatic pose. She went down on one knee before Brishee. She grabbed both Brishee's hands and said, "There's a lot we can do from here, from Mima. Think, girl." "What are you proposing?" "I say we raid." Cruith was radiant. There was a discussion that followed, but it was plain from the outset that raid it would be. Now, if there's no objections, I'm going to try and get through the raid, which should take me like another 5 minutes. So you all kind of with me here still? Oh, good. You are still here. But if you have to go, I understand. We're going to try and get through the raid. Raid, 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 raid. Raid! Percy finally had his wish. He was being made king. After his last boiling, he had awakened, not in his cell, but had found himself sitting on a high throne. His ugly subjects lay prone before him. There was a crown of sorts, and a scepter consisting of a stick with a slime snake's horn tied to the end of it in his hand. It was easy enough to understand what had happened. It was, however, a complete mystery as to why. An older Drofna approached and bowed. He was speaking to Percy in his own tongue and pointing to an opening in the huge cavern where they had assembled. At first, Percy thought the ancient decaying creature wanted him to exit the hall through the opening. But just as he was about to rise, 4 young and relatively healthy Drofna entered carrying the round dish from under the boiling pot between them. This did nothing to answer Percy's questions until they stood, the thing on edge, and the coat of arms painted on it was revealed. Percy stood staring at it. The coat of arms was the royal house of Galaway. He was looking at the shield of many uses. Almost in a trance, Percy approached the shield. He took it from its bearer and turned it around. The arm straps had been replaced, and they fitted easily over his arm. He held the shield up and over the heads of the Drofna. The cheering lasted for many minutes. The Rog of the Drofna had accepted the shield and would lead them in their holy war against Mima. Percy had no clue what the cheering was about, but he knew it was better than being boiled. He finally had control, well, if not understanding, of the situation. Cruith led the party down a small tunnel. The confines of the tunnel not only forced them into a ridiculous duck walk, but it made them hold their sputtering torches close to their faces. It was an effort to watch for obstacles and not set their own hair on fire, and make any kind of progress as they crept single file into the earth. Elfane's eyes never left Brishee's bottom. He had to have something to keep his mind off his fear that the earth would at any moment crush him to death. Brishee's bottom was not only the most pleasant thing that he could contemplate at this time, it was the only thing he could see. His teeth ground together as if destroying his molars would somehow keep the terror away. If he let his mind wander for a second from contemplating Brishee's backside, his fear would squeeze his heart with icy fingers. Just let me get to a place where I can stand up again, he thought to himself. Then I'll be all right. If I can die standing upright, it won't be so bad. I just don't want to be crushed squatting like I've got the trots. Elfane stumbled, and after he had recovered, he could no longer see Brishee. It seemed that she'd vanished. He would have screamed if he'd not stumbled again, and fell headlong into a large open chamber. His torch was ground out in the dirt, and Elfane panicked and leapt to his feet, only to find Cruith, Maddie, and Brishee staring at him. Cruith snorted with disgust and said, "Honestly, did we have to bring the pets?" As if to answer her question, Dugan and Larry tumbled into the room. Larry's torch was had touched Dugan's head in the fall. The resulting blaze was quickly put out, but it left Dugan with an interesting hairstyle. Only the iron discipline of military training protected Larry from Dugan's wrath. Were he not a soldier on a mission, Dugan might have done some experimenting of his own with Larry's hair. "Well, if you boys are done rolling in the dirt, we can get on with this." Brishee turned to Cruith. "What do we do next?" The last really was a question. They were in a rough round chamber about 10 feet across. The light from their torches stretched up with fiery fingers that failed to find the ceiling. And they didn't seem to be another tunnel like the one they just exited from. "Well, from here, we take a little ride," answered Cruith. "Where?" Larry wanted to know. "Down?" "How?" asked Brishee. "With this." Cruith pulled the box containing the lost artifact from the pouch in her wrist. "Maddie, since you've been a good girl and not fallen down and put your torch out, please stick the handle into the soft dirt and keep a hand on it so it's nice and steady. Brishee, give me that rusty old cup you stole from the tinker's wagon, and Dugan, hand me your water skin." Soon she had her hand wrapped in the folds of her skirt to keep from burning herself, and Cruith was holding the cup of water over the blazing torch. She had placed the box containing the artifact across the mouth of the cup. All were still and silent as they waited for the steam to rise and the box to pop open. They all gasped when the lid flew open, revealing not only the artifact, but Percy's blackened fingernails and the connected flesh. Black. Surprised or not, Cruith's grab was deft, and she had the artifact out of the box before it snapped shut. "Now, I'll show you how this is supposed to work," she said as she stood and used the hot water to rinse the putrid pieces of Percy from the... that was a good one. Putrid pieces of Percy from the crystal key. Deep below them, the Drothna's noses twitched. The smell of madness still contained in Percy's fingernails brought all activity to a standstill. Instantly, they all oriented on the direction of the smell and began to follow their noses to its source. Percy couldn't help but notice the sudden distraction by his adopted subjects. He stood in puzzlement for a minute or two while the Drothna filed past him in what appeared to be a trance of some kind. He shrugged his shoulders and followed, thinking, well, I guess there's only one way to find out, and he picked up the shield of many uses as he left. "Hey, Larry! Think quick!" Cruith tossed the metal box of the artifact to him. Larry didn't think and dropped the torch to catch it. "Why we let men rule the world is a complete mystery to me," commented Cruith as Larry sheepishly squatted to pick up his torch. "How does the artifact take us to the Drothna?" Elfane's curiosity was edging the fear out of his mind. Besides, he could stand up now. "See that over there?" said Cruith, pointing at the wall of the cavern. That looks like a crack in the wall? What do you think that is?" Elfane peered at the spot in the torchlight and shrugged and said, "I don't know. What is it?" "Well, it's a crack in the wall, son!" Cruith waited for his face to redden and then went on. "Into it I put what my people call the key to the mountain." Cruith's actions followed her words. She slipped the artifact into the slot and mumbled in the language of the Mima and made strange signs in the air with her left hand. The floor dropped out from under them. Brishee, Maddie, and Cruith immediately adjusted their centers of gravity and held steady, as did Dugan, Larry, and Elfane. Oh, yes, as Dugan, Larry, and Elfane fell against the walls, which now, against all reason, were sliding past them, vertically. The rough stone walls skinned them both. Elfane quickly got his balance, and soon, wide-eyed, too befuddled to question the event, And Larry, after bouncing off the wall and getting a nasty bump on his head in the process, simply sat on his butt and stared at Cruith. And this only confused him more because a section of wall by Cruith wasn't moving at all, and she still had in her hand the key. He struggled to his feet and walked toward her. He almost fell again when the floor suddenly stopped its descent. Percy found himself in the middle of the swelling tribe of Drafna because the blue glow that permeated the caverns of the Drafna. Percy could see what they were all looking at. Sight of what on earth rounds of his domain appeared to be a community garbage chute. It didn't clarify his state of mind. Why were they looking at that, he wondered. A round hole in the wall of the cavern was all it was. The hole had been that he had seen the Drafna throwing garbage into. What little garbage they didn't dispose of by eating, that is. Percy's thoughts led him to push through the crowd of scabby creatures. As he came to the mouth of the hole, he noticed that the Drafna all seemed to be sniffing with a gleam, expectant eyes, and looking up. He, too, found that he himself was looking as he perceived a distant rumbling. The air moved out of the tunnel and stirring Percy's forelock slightly and revealed the T that remained there as a brand. The movement of air quickly increased to a breeze and then a wind. Taking a half step back, Percy retched. The Drafna inhaled with delight. This winter's batch of booze was going to be a good one. The wind was cut off in a twinkling, and standing before him on a floor of stone was, incongruously, the questing party, and some woman who looked familiar but that he couldn't place. Directly in front of him and within arm's reach was Larry, the prince. The Drafna grunted in confusion. They could smell the madness, yet none of the creatures appeared to be mad. Mulling this over stopped them dead in their tracks. It didn't stop Percy. Before him stood Larry, and in Larry's hand was the metal box, which he knew housed the lost artifact. There was only one thing to do: reach out with his right arm, grab Larry with his left, and use the shield to bash back anybody who tried to save the prince. The sight of the masked Drafna sent Cruith into instant action. She twisted the key to the mountain in the opposite direction, began her chanting and signing with her left hand. When the floor pressed up against them, she was not aware that Larry had been taken. And that is where we stop. Prince Larry has been taken by Percy and the Drafna. And next week, next week, we'll find out what happens when the people of Mima and the Drafna go to war. And it's entirely possible we might even find out what happens to Prince Monaghan. In the last section of Beggar's Day, Book 1, The Beggar Prince, which is available online in an ebook form. And we'll have, sometime before next Monday, we'll have this session up on our YouTube channel.